Hi, listeners. Welcome back. This is Kendra Debany from Gettysburg House Histories, and today I thought what we'd talk about is one of the battlefield houses. I thought you'd give you a treat. When I was thinking about which battlefield house to do, I wanted to get something that really you're very familiar with, that really stands out. So the farm that I chose to talk about today is the Nicholas Codori Farm. And just in case you haven't been to Gettysburg or you're not familiar with the area, this house actually sits right along the Emmitsburg Road, pretty much right smack in the middle of the Pickett's Charge Field, near the high water mark. You cannot miss this farm. If you've ever been to Gettysburg, or if you read about it, it will be mentioned absolutely. So let's talk today about the Nicholas Codori Farm. Nicholas Codori's farm. And again, when I refer to it as Nicholas Codori, I always refer to the battlefield owner in my podcast, so that the battlefield era owner. But Nicholas Codori's farm is interesting because it has a long history of owners throughout the years renting the property. This is one of the few properties that I've researched where I've seen from the beginning of when the land is first settled all the way through the ownership that the owner never lives on the land. So this is something I had never come across. This is the first instance. And if you've listened to my podcasts in the past, you've heard me speak many times about one of my biggest pet peeves, which is trying to find renters. It is so hard to find renters, and if I can't find them, then I lose a big chunk of a house's history. So with the Codori Farm being a house that was always rented, this is just a very frustrating house to try to do research on. As you'll see when we get to the battlefield, the time of the battle, the renter situation is just so difficult. But what I want to do, as I do with all of the podcasts, I want to take you back to the beginning of the beginning. So we're going to talk, actually, I won't bring you all the way back. I think we were going to start you on this podcast right around late 1790s. Samuel Sloan was a gentleman who owned this property from 1797 to 1833. And again, an owner who did not live there. In 1798, this property was described as having a dwelling house built of old logs, 35 feet by 17 feet, 2 stories high, with 4 windows and 12 lights, or 12 panes of glass. It also had 1 log barn that was 60 feet by 30 feet, 1 cabin 20 feet by 18 feet, and the total property acreage was 236 acres. When they talk about a building that's built of old logs as opposed to new logs or just logs, that to me is saying that this is a house that was built early on. So this may be a first period house that when the land was first settled in the 1740s, that this is the original house that was on the property. And when they refer to the cabin, they are probably referring to a tenant type house, a little quickie structure that was first thrown up on the property when the settlers first arrived. So again, this is 236 acres in the period from 1797 to 1833. Samuel Sloan, a little bit about him. He actually owned another battlefield farm that you might or might not be familiar with. He owned the Samuel Codori Farm over on the Carlisle Road. So this is north of Gettysburg. If you're going up Route 34 on the Carlisle Road, the Samuel Codori Farm sits. It's a big brick house that sits off to the left, way back off the road. In a very brief advertisement for the property, it is described as an estate of 236 acres with a log house and barn and well. In 1834, another real estate investor, C. Michael Clarkson, purchased the property from the Sloan estate. Clarkson another real estate investor, owned multiple properties in Adams County at this time, including what would become later known as the McPherson Farm on the First Days Field and the Widow Thompson property, also on the First Days Battlefield, which would become the area of General Lee's headquarters. Now, in 1854, Sheriff Henry Thomas seized C. Michael Clarkson's Emmitsburg Road property for non-payment of debt. Apparently, C. Michael Clarkson did a little too much real estate dabbling, and some poor business decision-making left Clarkson with a slew of financial problems. This is very, very common. We see this a lot, especially with people who are real estate investors. I've researched a number of the houses where this exact thing happens. An advertisement in the newspaper on September 18th, 1854, listing the property for sale, describes it as having a 2-story log house, frame stable, a well of water, and other outbuildings. So here we are. This is 1854. And the house on the Codori Farm is still a log house. And I say this because you will often hear that the brick house standing on the property was built in 1834. This just clearly wasn't the case. So when somebody tells you, oh, the Codori house was built in 1834, the paper proof in the advertisement tells you that no, it was not. It was still log in 54, 20 years later. Question has been raised to me, where was the original log house? Unfortunately, we don't know for sure. As I mentioned in other podcasts, sometimes the early surveys of the property in the county will show exactly where the original house sat, but unfortunately, on this track, it does not show where the original house was, so we don't know. I've heard people say that Codori just bricked over the log house and that the original log house is underneath the bricks. Although I have seen a few examples of bricks over log houses in the county, there's very, very few occurrences I've come across where this happens. If you're talking weatherboarding over the logs, yes, that's very, very common. But bricking over or stoning over log was not a common common occurrence. Most of the time, when a new house is built to replace an older structure, it's built pretty close to where the original house stood. A lot of times you'll see it hasn't moved very far at all. And as I've also mentioned in other podcasts, it was common to move the old building up against the new house or near the new house so that it could be used as an out kitchen or an attached kitchen. So where the original log house was on the Codori Farm, I'm going to say it was probably pretty darn close to where the current house sits today, but we, again, don't know exactly where. So getting back to things here, Nicholas Codori purchased the property from Sheriff Thomas on November 22nd, 1854 for $1,510. At the time of his purchase, the land had been split up and his share of the farm consisted of 111 acres. Nicholas Codori followed in the footsteps of previous and later owners and never lived on the land and always rented out the farm. Now, who exactly was Nicholas Codori? Let's just take a quick look at him. At the time of his purchase, Nicholas Codori was 45 years old and lived on York Street in the borough of Gettysburg. And in the borough, he made his living as a butcher. He was originally from France and had immigrated to the United States in 1828 and came immediately to Adams County. Now, upon his arrival, he apprenticed in the butcher trade under Anthony Kuntz, and he started off in the butchering business on a very, very small scale. So after his apprenticeship, he started off really small, but he quickly grew in size and gained the confidence of the local citizens. Now, in 1835, Nicholas Codori had married Elizabeth Martin, and together they had 3 children, George, Simon, and John. John, unfortunately, had passed away a little earlier at the age of 10 months, so John did not survive adulthood. Loss of children, unfortunately, as I've mentioned in the past, very, very common. It's very sad. A lot of people in this time period just expected to lose children. It was if all of your children survived to adulthood, it was something to really be celebrated. Loss of children was so common with all the childhood diseases. Codori was active in local committees and politics throughout the years of his life, and just a few examples here. We don't want to dig too deep into him, but in 1844, he was a town councilman. In 1852, he was part of a committee working to help build a Catholic church in town. In 1862, he was on a loan committee with the Gettysburg Beneficial Association. And in 1864, he was a member of the Relief Committee of Gettysburg. Both of these committees were designed to supply the wants of the destitute in Gettysburg. And just as a side note, this Relief Committee in 1864 was formed for the purpose of lending aid to those who were left destitute because of the losses they had suffered as a result of the battle. So even in 1864, they were still having a lot of issues with people who had lost everything during the battle. Now, Nicholas Codori was also a real estate investor, but for a different reason than most people who invested in real estate. Codori didn't believe in banks and financial institutions, so he put his money into real estate, which he felt was an investment that was safe. So he wasn't a bank person. He put all his money in real estate. And as a real estate investor, he made improvements to the properties he owned in an effort to increase their value. And it was for this reason that shortly after buying the Emmitsburg Road farm, he began to make improvements to the property. His first order of business was to build a new brick house to replace the existing log structure. The new brick house he ended up building was 2 stories tall and 1 room deep. So just the front section. So at the time of the battle, the rear part of Nicholas Codori's house didn't exist. And we'll talk more about this in a few minutes. But just so you know, at the time of the battle, it was just, when you drive down the road, it was just the front section upstairs and down. So let's start getting into the history of the farm during the battle. Perhaps one of the most often asked questions about this farm is, who was living there during the battle? Oh, renters. Okay, now what do we know for sure? We know for sure that Nicholas Codori was living in the borough of Gettysburg and that the farm was being rented, absolutely for sure. Now the question is, who was renting there? And I will say again here, finding renters is absolutely the hardest and most frustrating part of my job as a house historian. Oh boy, let me tell you. And as I just mentioned previously at the start of this podcast, is if you cannot find a renter, you lose such a huge chunk of a history of a house. And in the case of the Codori house, that's a big chunk of very important history that you're losing if you don't have who the renter was. Now, I've been through the years trying every little researching tip and trick I can think of, and I'm going to leave it at this. I'm still working on it. I haven't given up, but as of right now, I can't say for sure who was there. There's been many guesses over the years, including John Staub and Jacob Riley, who was a later owner. One of the most popular assumptions is that John Staub was the renter. Although I know that Staub and his wife, who was Nicholas Codori's niece, did rent out the Codori house for some time, at least through the fall of 1861. I don't think they were there during the battle. This is just based on, I'm never going to say never, but based on the research I've done, Staub had actually purchased land from the Plank Estate. So this is the Henry Spangler farm that's behind the Sherfy farm. He had purchased that land in early 1862. And he does have a house at that site, which is clearly indicated by his tax rate. So could it be possible that Staub was away fighting in the army and that Catherine, his wife, packed up the house and went to stay over at her uncle's house down the road? Sure, it could be. Or could it be that Catherine went there upon hearing about the approach of the enemy? Again, yeah, possible, could be. Now, Catherine Staub's obituary is probably what causes the most Staub renter confusion, because it stated that, quote, for many years, the Staubs rented the old Codori farm on the battlefield. Yes, they did rent out the Codori house on the battlefield for many years, but was that during the battle? I believe there's actually an account out there that states that they were renting during the battle. I think a different version of her obituary says during the battle, but who knows at this point. But my feeling is that it appears to me that John Staub had purchased the land behind the Sherfy farm from the Plank Estate, and that he did that in early January of 1862. So he would have had he had a house built on that land. So I believe a house was standing there at the time of the battle, and that's where I think they were. There's also an account of an old gentleman at the Codori house asking the commander of the Vermont Brigade not to tear down his fence or trample his crops. And who is that? And is that really true? Speculation is that this person is Anthony Codori, who was Catherine's father. But somewhere along the way, I seem to recall hearing that he lived in the borough of Gettysburg at the time of the battle. So I don't know. So many questions. And can you see why I love renters so much? And here's a better question. Why would anybody still be on the farm? My guess is that whoever the renter was, he, she, they left the farm and headed off to safety before the fighting began on the second day of the battle. For some houses in the area, you can make the case that the owner stuck around to look over the property. I've seen this in many cases that, they were around watching over their farm. But for this property in particular, I find it really hard to believe that someone would have stayed at that house being located where it was in between the lines with all of the fighting taking place, that somebody wouldn't have said, hey, get out of there, or you'd have enough common sense to leave yourself. Now, on days 2 and 3 of the battle, the Codori farm sat smack, like I just said, smack right thick in the middle of the fighting. Fortunately, very fortunately, unlike their neighbors across the way, the Bliss family, the Codori house was not put to the torch, although rumor has it that the 82nd New York had orders to burn it down at one point. Rumor also has it that they chose to disobey these orders because wounded men were taking refuge inside. One of these wounded men, Sergeant Magnitsky of the 20th Massachusetts, who was wounded on the skirmish line and concealed himself in the house to avoid capture. So that's the rumor, that it was set to be burned, and because it was housing the wounded, it was not. The house where it sat definitely took the brunt of some of the severest fighting in the battle. Hundreds of deaths occurred over Codori's farm fields. In fact, I saw one account that stated that more Confederates were buried on Codori's farm than any other farm on the battlefield. And the number was given as being over 500 burials. The Codori house was not used by either army as an aid station or hospital during the fighting, obviously because of the location between the lines. It was just way too dangerous. After the battle, of course, once the Confederate Army had moved out, the house was used for hospital purposes, just like pretty much every house in the area. The wounded took refuge there. And after all of the enemy left, as I just said, every single house, and some people say, well, they only the houses that have the hospital signs on them were used as hospitals, and all of the rest, none of the other farms were used. Well, that's just absolute ludicrous. When you consider the amount of the number of casualties, the more severe cases were treated closer to the battlefield in the houses that were on the battlefield and closer to it. But all of the farms in the area, 5 miles out, all the way around, were used to help treat the wounded. Yes, of course, it would have been the walk-in wounded and the lesser wounded, but all of the farms in the area were used, most especially if you were on a water source. If your farm had a stream going through it or you were on a water source, that would have been a very desirable place to help care for the injured. Now, after the battle, I don't think it really takes too much of an imagination to picture what the Codori Farm looked like after being where it was. I don't think you have to really use your imagination too hard. But what could they do? Your fence rails are gone. Your brick house is pockmarked full of bullets. And Codori, let's think about Codori too. Not only did he have damage to this property, but he also lived in the borough. And as we all know, the Confederate Army had overtaken the borough during the battle. So there's also, the damages, personal property that was stolen, and damages that were done to his home. And he probably also, which I don't know right now, but he probably also owned other real estate at the time too. Remember, I said he was a real estate investor. So anything else that he owned, you just take into account all of the damage that was done to all of these farms and properties. But what else could you do? You picked up and you moved on, and that's what they did, and that's what everyone else had to do. Fortunately for Codori, he had the financial ability to pick up and carry on. And as I mentioned previously with the 1864 Relief Committee, some of the people lost everything during the battle, and they were never able to financially get back on their feet. Some of the people who may have been farmers or renting farms in the area actually had to, may have had to take another job as doing manual work or something else because they lost everything. But Codori fortunately had the financial ability to pick up the pieces and carry on and rebuild. At some time in the years after the battle, Jacob Riley became associated with the property, perhaps as a renter first, which is possibly my suspicion. Now, again, as I mentioned previously, Jacob Riley was one of those names floated around as possibly renting the Codori Farm during the battle. There was actually one account that I saw that said a descendant had said that the family were renting the house during the battle and that they lived there during the battle and stuff. But again, it's how many people can possibly be renting this farm at the time of the battle? Now, on January 10th, 1868, Nicholas Codori sold the property to Jacob Riley for $6,485. So that's a pretty significant amount for 111 acres. 111. I think he's still at 111 acres. That's a pretty good amount for the property. So by 1868, what this tells me is that the farm is very productive because, again, at this point in time, the house on the land is still just the 2-story brick house, 1 room deep. So the addition is not on the property at this time. So you would have had your house, your barn, your outbuildings. So this is a pretty significant amount, which also tells me that the land was in a high state of cultivation, and that he was a very the whoever was renting or farming, that it was very, very highly productive. The sale of the property from Codori to Riley was based on a payment plan schedule, with Riley paying Codori. This was common. So basically what was happening is Nicholas Codori was holding the mortgage for the property, and Riley, instead of a bank holding the mortgage, Riley was making the payments to Codori. This also kind of smells a little to me like maybe he was renting. I'm not saying at the time of the battle, but I'm saying that prior to his purchase, he may have been renting there. And they may have made some kind of agreement that instead of paying rental payments, hey, how about if I sell you the property and you make the payments on a mortgage to the house, so you're actually paying toward something. Now, apparently there was a problem with this arrangement. Or a change in plans. Something happened because on April 1st, 1872, Riley sold the property back to Nicholas Codori. So he had purchased in January of 1868, and then by April of 72, he's selling it back. So I don't know if he had issues with paying, if they didn't get along, if something fell through. Maybe there was an illness in the family. I don't know exactly what happened that forced Riley to sell back to Codori. In March of 1876, Nicholas Codori began construction of a slaughterhouse and hog pen on the farm. Now, according to one source, Nicholas Codori was forced, along with about 4 other slaughterhouse operators, out of the borough limits, the Gettysburg borough limits, by a borough council action. So it could be that at this time, they did not want butchering businesses taking place for sanitary reasons in the borough of Gettysburg. So in 76, he actually builds his slaughterhouse and hog pens on the Emmitsburg Road. And where he built it was actually across the street from where the barn sits today. So there is pictures of that. It was during November and December of 1877 that Nicholas Codori added the 2-story brick back building to the house. So November and December of 1877. A newspaper account actually stated that Joseph J. Smith was the builder of the addition. So again, at this time, we don't know who was renting the farm, but we do know that Nicholas Codori still had the property rented, that the addition was now on the property, and that he had moved his slaughtering business, his butchering business, to the farm. But Nicholas Codori is still not living there. And on July 11th, 1878, Nicholas Codori is going to suffer a really severe farming accident. I've talked in the past about how dangerous farming was, and how many accidents. I come across a ton of accidents of different, varying degrees of intensity, let's put it that way. And some of them are pretty severe. And this one was actually really severe. And what I want to do is just, the account was so descriptive and so good. I'm just going to read you the entire account so you can hear what exactly happened to Mr. Codori. So this is quoting from the newspaper. On Monday last, Mr. Nicholas Codori, the well-known butcher of this place, met with a terrible accident when a mowing machine, which may prove fatal. After breakfast, he hitched up a favorite young colt team in a spring wagon and drove out to his farm a short distance southwest of town, intending to mow a field of grass, and transferred the colt team from the spring wagon to the mower. It was a sprightly team and had never been hitched to a mower. The rattle of the machine frightened the team, which started to run, and Mr. Codori was thrown from his seat in front of or on the knives. Sometime after, probably half an hour, Mr. Butt, the tenant, noticed the team and mower standing up in the orchard some distance from the grass field. He went over, secured the team, and then went in search of Mr. Codori. He was found sitting in the grass with right foot severed from the leg immediately above the ankle and shockingly cut and injured in the groin. Strange to say, Mr. Codori was not only sensible, but showed self-possession and composure, giving orders that he be driven to town and directing his missing foot to be brought along with him. He was put in a spring wagon and remained in a sitting posture, saluting with his usual pleasant greeting acquaintances he met along the way. Directing the driver to drive to Dr. Horner's, he told the doctor that he had lost a leg and wanted his services at his residence. The bones of the leg above the ankle, where the limb had been severed by the mower, being splintered, it was found necessary to amputate the leg below the knee. The wounds about the groin were also dressed. The latter are the most serious, and from them the most danger is apprehended. Notwithstanding Mr. Codori's vigorous constitution, his injuries are such as to excite grave apprehensions as to the results. And as predicted, Nicholas Codori did not survive his injuries. According to the wishes in his will, when Nicholas Codori died, the property transferred to his son Simon. And like his father and all previous owners, Simon Codori continued to rent out the farm. In 1879, Nicholas Codori's heirs submitted a claim with the federal government for damages from the Battle of Gettysburg, totaling $3,489. This is a substantial amount. When you consider that the average real estate value of a farm at that time would have been around $5,000, and actually in 1863 around $4,500. $3,489 was a lot of money in damages. Now, as the owner of the farm, the Codori heirs had submitted a claim for damages done to Codori's buildings, fences, fields, etc. Whoever the battlefield era renter was, if that person so chose, he could submit his own claim for damages that he incurred, and the renter's damages would have been for personal items like food, hay, growing crops, blankets, any kind of personal goods. The Codori's heirs' claim was denied because the Quartermaster General was, quote, unable to certify that I am convinced that the stores have been actually received or taken for the use and was used by the U.S. Army, end quote. And as I have mentioned in previous podcasts and presentations, the federal government refused to compensate owners for damages done by Confederate troops. And if you couldn't prove who caused the damage, you were denied. And if you could prove that it was the federal army, you were often denied anyway, just for the heck of it. So where the Codori farm is, they couldn't prove whether the damages were caused by the federal army or the Confederate army being in between the lines. So if the Confederates are shooting and they're blowing holes into your windows and you're destroying your bricks and ruining your barn, it's Confederate damage. So, they were in a pickle where they were. In 1882, the heirs resubmitted the claim for damages, but this time for a lesser amount of $2,417. Once again, they were denied. They were never compensated for their losses. Pretty standard, as I just mentioned. I'm not surprised by that at all. Now, unfortunately, the art in 1882, fortunately and unfortunately, in 1882, photographer William Tipton was hired to take pictures of the battlefield landscape to guide the artist Paul, oh boy, I'm going to botch this, Philippeau in his painting of the Gettysburg cyclorama. So William Tipton went around. He took pictures, mostly from the high watermark era, all the way around, taking pictures of the landscape for the artist when he painted, to guide him as he painted the cyclorama. Now, unfortunately, the artist painted in exactly what he saw in these pictures. So when you go and see the cyclorama painting today, you will see the entire Codori house painted there. And what do we know? we know that the back portion of the Codori house did not exist at the time of the battle. So I've actually seen, not only in the cyclorama, in the cyclorama painting, but there are also artists who have drawn sketches of the battle where you see the entire house there, which we all know 1877 was that edition. But on the opposite side of things, we're very fortunate that Tipton took the photographs when he did, because in just a few short months, Simon Codori tore down the Civil War barn on the property. So these 1882 Tipton photographs let us see what the Civil War barn looked like, albeit from a distance. So this is a very, very good thing. You can see in these pictures the barn, what the outbuildings look like. So we're glad that he did that, because in June of 1882, Simon Codori actually built the barn that sits on the property today. Now, some accounts I've heard all over the place. Some accounts say that the old barn was razed with the foundation left intact, and that the new barn was built on that foundation. And then there is another story that says that the new barn was built all around the foundation and that it still exists somewhere inside the barn. I haven't been in the barn, so I can't say for sure. And unfortunately, Tipton's photographs were taken from such a distance that it's really hard to determine where exactly the original barn sat. It looks like it's in the general vicinity of where the barn is today, but from the angle and from the distance, it's really hard to exactly map it out. Now, around 1889, give or take a year, a gentleman by the name of William Redding became a tenant on the Codori Farm. And Redding actually would remain a tenant on the property for over 50 years through multiple owners. So yay for knowing a renter, and yay for a renter that stayed around so long. So there's a lot of history that's still there on the under Redding's ownership. On February 28, 1894, Simon Codori sold the property to J. Emery Bear. J. Emery Bear was a real estate investor. He also sat on many boards. A lot of times when I'm doing house research, especially the battlefield properties, his name is involved as acquiring the properties and then turning them over and selling them to the government. So on June 21st, 1907, this is exactly what he does with the Codori Farm. That's the date that the property was sold to the federal government. So June 21st, 1907. The last surviving Civil War outbuilding on the property, which was the bake oven, was actually destroyed in a really bad storm in 1936. Now today, the front part of the house, the Codori house, is the only surviving Civil War structure on the farm. Everything else that you see there today is post-war. So that is just a very brief history of the Codori Farm. I hope you enjoyed this podcast and that you learned something new. We'll talk about some more farm history, some more battlefield history the next time I talk to you. So take care. And this is Kendra Debany from Gettysburg House Histories. Have a great day.